What's going on, everybody? Welcome to this week's Lumix Live. This is a very welcomed return back to my home studio. As those of that have watched over the last 2 weeks, we've done one stream from the GH5 Mark II out in just outside of Austin, Texas, overlooking Pennybacker Bridge, which was a really fun stream to do, showing off the reliability and just kind of how solid the wireless live streaming can be on that camera. And then if you joined us last week, we did the broadcast, or tried to do the broadcast from Cine Gear, the expo out in Los Angeles, but did run into some audio issues that were totally on my part with the wireless microphone that I was using. So I am in the process of trying to edit that up a little bit, kind of cut out some of the dead air space, and get that reposted. But this week, kind of wanted to take an opportunity to just talk about some of the things that we showed at Cine Gear, different ways that we've found to integrate the box camera into just kind of different applications, really cool opportunities that this camera offers you guys. If you are joining us for a long time, you notice too that my camera angle is a little different. I actually have to be using my S1H again because I've got my box camera down here, so I can actually show you guys some of the cool things that we've done with this camera. So yeah, changing things up just a little bit. If this is the first Lumix Live that you are joining us with, welcome. These are our weekly broadcasts that we do over here on YouTube, starting to actually expand out into, not just here in my home studio, but also out in the field in some locations. Maybe not from trade shows until I can figure the audio solutions out a little bit better. But yeah, we have conversations about technologies that are in Lumix cameras, the current state of cameras that are out. We don't really talk too much about cameras that are coming, so everyone knows the GH6 was announced, but there's no new information that I can share with anybody at this time, so just getting that out of the way right away. I also don't have any new information on the 35mm 1.8, so certain things don't really have a ton of ability to talk about, but these are the opportunities that you have to be reaching out to us directly and get your questions answered. We pretty much can discuss almost any topic that's out there other than the ones like what I just mentioned, because I don't have any new information for you. But yeah, when it's not a conversation like this, we'll try to have some guests on, either Matt Frazier, who was with us out at Cine Gear. We'll also typically have other filmmakers joining us, some other industry members from time to time, so that you can actually be able to ask more questions that aren't just about Lumix, but just about, maybe some of the integrations that we have, some of the other opportunities that you have to work with our cameras and tools that can help you get a better result in the end. It's awesome to see some people joining in here. If you are joining us, make sure to shout out in the chat where you're joining us from. I love seeing, from where everyone's actually tuning in from. I see we've got some from Sweden, we got some Italy. I know that we've got some US team here as well. Also from Toronto, Canada, which is awesome to see. So yeah, keep shouting those things out in the chat. I did drop a poll in this chat as well at the beginning, because I'm curious to see how many people actually utilize the Lumix Sync app or the Image app, depending on which cameras you're using, and just try to get a feel for who's using it, and if you're not using it, what would the reasons be for not using it? Because I'm super curious just about all that kind of stuff. So let's see here. Hi, Dennis. Hey, Rudolph. Hi, Cam, JD, George, Tyler, joining from Virginia. All right. George from Tennessee. I'm actually going to be up in your region near the end of the month. Well, maybe not Chattanooga. Not 100% up on my geography of Tennessee, but we have another trade show coming up in the end of October that I will be out at, actually showing one of the cool things that we're talking about today. So with that, I want to remind everybody about the Lumix Pro Services platform that we have. It is our back-end support program for photographers and videographers out there. There's the red tier, which is a free option for anybody that owns a Lumix camera. You're able to jump over. If you're in the United States, you can use the QR codes, or you can take a look at the link that I just dropped in the chat. If you are joining us from overseas, you can take a look at the link that I'm dropping in the chat right now. This will bring you to the global portal for Lumix Pro Services, which will have links to the various different regions that currently support Lumix Pro Services. There are additional coming. So if you don't see it in your region, reach out to your local Panasonic team, your local Panasonic social media teams. Let them know that it's something that you're looking for, and they'd be able to help you out through there. But the red tier and the platinum tier, at least here in the United States, these, like I said, these are our back-end support programs. The red tier is free for pretty much anybody that wants to get in, kind of a just community service kind of platform where if you happen to need to send your camera in for service, you've got an online portal to do so and track everything about it. And then we have the platinum membership level, which is a paid level, just like most, pro service programs out there. But the Platinum service gets you that 3-year warranty just like the red one does for manufacturer defects. You get 2-day repair turnaround with free next-day shipping both ways, 20% for off out-of-warranty repairs, which would be, situations where maybe if you drop a camera, drop a lens, and it needs to get repaired and it's not something that's a defect, you'd be able to get that repaired at 20% off. You also get annual sensor cleanings, EVF cleanings, lens calibrations, and firmware update services, and you get an exclusive membership hotline. So you get a phone number that you can actually call in and speak to an actual human instead of having to go through chat or through a prompt if that's something that you prefer to do. And then the last thing that you get with that is a really cool Peak Design strap that is customized with the Lumix Pro Service logo. So you get the nicer upgraded strap as well. So if you're interested in the US, take a look at the QR codes that were up. I'll show it again at the end of the stream. If you're outside of the United States, take a look at the second link that I dropped in the chat, and you can click through to your region and take a look at what the requirements are for your particular region. Not every region has the same tier structure for the programs, but every region has some sort of program available. So, the last thing I want to cover is if you have questions that you want to have answered on the stream, direct from the source, make sure to tag @LumixCameras before the question so I can see it on my end. It'll pop up yellow on my side, so I know that it's not just a general conversation, but it's something that's actually being directed and that you have that you're looking for an answer with. So, let's start with taking a look at some of the questions that we've got here. I see Ulrich is asking, AF in Vfr mode before recording seems to be one of the most interesting new features in the GH5 Mark II. Can you do a demonstration? I can't do a demonstration with the setup that I have, but basically it's actually quite simple. Since the camera gets put into manual focus when you're in VFR mode, and if you're looking at an original GH5 or a G9 or some of the other cameras that have a VFR mode, the camera goes into manual focus because the sensor scan read is so much faster, and you lose audio. But with the newer setup in the Mark II, what it allows you to do is what I would call like push AF, where it's a single point AF. So something as simple as really just using the AF on button in the back of the camera, and wherever that box is, that when you're in manual focus, that I know a number of people are, I'd say a 50-50 split. Some people want to have the thing just totally removed. You want to have a totally clean display on the back of your camera. Others, it's just par for the course with these cameras. But wherever that box is set on the frame, that's where your one area or one push AF is going to target. So you'll be able to do that, have it push to that point, and then you're good to go. It makes it actually a lot more useful for cameras that don't have the hardware to support things like linear AF or linear manual focus, or the focus ring control, where you can change the actual degrees of the lens. So in some cases, yeah, it's a little bit of a challenge with with using it if you're using traditional focus by wire lenses, but on on newer cameras, it's just another thing that we've been able to add because hardware has matured over time. Let's see here. What other questions we got? From Toronto, Ontario, I'm really looking forward to the new GH6. Yes, so am I. Cam, if the GH6 doesn't have a certain dynamic range, I can't comment on dynamic range or anything about the camera yet, so just stay tuned. More information will be coming. Let's see here. Tyler says, what city in Tennessee trade show? My family's in Nashville, so be tempted to make a trip if it's close. So the show that I'm doing is called SALT. Well, as long as everything is fine with the world, or relatively fine with the world, I'll be up in just outside of Nashville around October 20th. Again, the show's called SALT. I think it's like a town right outside of Nashville. So if you happen to be there and you happen to be, it's a more of a religious facilities type expo where we're going to be demoing the BGH1 in kind of different applications. So if you happen to be up in that area, or if you are in that area and aren't actually going to the trade show, hit us up on social media. Something I'd love to do when we start getting back to more trade shows and more in the field opportunities is actually kind of do some of those like fan meetup kind of things, where if we're going to be at a trade show, meet up for a LUMIX Live kind of thing, but we're still a little way out for things like that. Let's see here. Redbit, hi Sean, did you find time to investigate the compatibility of LUMIX teleconverters with Sigma lenses, talking about the S-line? So I've been able to look a little bit into it. From what I've been told, because I haven't been able to get hands-on with our teleconverter on a Sigma lens, a lens that can take a teleconverter. From what I've been told, I don't think they will work 100%. You may run into some challenges with either just the way the adapters are designed and the way the internals are designed on the back end of lenses that take teleconverters. So we'll have to take a look at it and just get more information for you. So I'm sorry I don't have that much more info for you, Redbit. Let's see here. There we go. Can the S1H send true 2448p to an external recorder? I asked this a couple weeks ago and you were unsure, wondering if you had an opportunity to ask a technician. Yes, so I do have more information about that in particular. So 48 frame and true 24p. So we're talking 24.00, not 23, was it 2398? Those two particular frame rates are not in, from what I've been told, not in the actual HDMI specification as frame rates. So that's why they don't go out. I know that there are some that are kind of skirting the system and forcing it to work. But we typically, if we're going to deploy something, it's within a standard, especially if it's something to do with, say, like the HDMI standard. You have to be compliant with what the actual specification is. Things above and beyond that specification are a little bit of a different story. As long as you're meeting the actual specifications, especially if you're part of the HDMI specification, or you work with products that have to adhere to it. So true 24p and 48p, to my understanding, what I've been told is they're just not frame rates that are available in the spec. That does not mean, or that does not preclude things changing in the future. The more people that bring that kind of question up, the more, we're able to just push the topic harder with engineers and people who are much more in the know than I am, or anybody that's outside of actually working in the technical side of the brand. So yeah, the more you guys ask those kinds of questions, the more we can always be pushing that information over. The real Aaron Collins, hey there guys. It was good meeting you at Cine Gear. Yes, it was nice meeting you too over at Cine Gear. So if anyone was over at Cine Gear, it was a very interesting show this year. So it was cool to see some people that do tune in to LUMIX Live and some people who have only maybe caught a couple of them. And as we do more of these things, we are going to try to continue to do broadcasting from the shows. Like I said, just as I work with fixing up some of the audio issues, maybe going wired for audio instead of wireless in a trade show in a convention center. That would have been much better. That was an oversight on my part. So let's see here. Rudolph says, only have one working smartphone. With two, would be able to control the camera and gimbal. Paired with my 45 to 175 with electric zoom, this could be very useful. Yeah, so for anybody that's working with, say, like the Ronin gimbals or any kind of gimbal that interfaces with your phone, yeah, in some cases that does cause a bit of an overlap, where you've got the app control for the gimbal taking up 90% of the phone's capacity, and then in some cases not having enough bandwidth to work with a second phone. But that's kind of the cool thing, is that the app, it's not a heavy app, and if you've never used it before, or if it's something that you are interested in looking at, I've just dropped a chat down in the link down in the chat that'll bring you to our global site, which will give you some of the info about the app, and then I believe it has links to the iOS and the Android version of it, and which cameras are compatible, so you'll be able to actually see what you can do with it. A lot of times with the gimbal usage, you may not actually need to use the app, because things like the Ronin, like I have an RS2 or an RSC2, that particular gimbal, when I have my camera attached to it and it's on the list of the ones that are compatible for USB control, that gives me like 90% of the things that I actually need to be changing in the gimbal, or actually on the camera, so I don't really necessarily need to jump over and use the app all the time. Let's see here. The real Aaron, are you back in Texas already, and are you going live on the Mark II right now? No, so I'm back in Texas. But I'm using the S1H right now because I have my BGH1 sitting right here, so we can talk about some of the things that actually you saw at the trade show. Let's see here. Jake asks, are there any pros to using the manual focus clutch on the S Pro lenses rather than set linear focus in the menus and doing it that way? That's actually a pretty good question. There are. In some cases, you may want a lens that has physical distance guide actually on the lens, so that if you're taping out your distances, and this is probably a much higher level production case, but if you're doing things where you want to be able to actually put the lens on, set it in manual focus, and know that I need to focus to 20 feet, I need to focus to 10 feet, using the clutch on the lenses that have the clutch will make that a lot easier, because it's measured and it's repeatable that way. Where if you're using the internal linear focus, you still do in some of the cameras, it's not all the cameras yet, but in some of the cameras you actually do get a feet or meter distance scale on the back instead of the little mountain and tree. You can get some of the same information there, but for some it's just easier to use the clutch. So really it's just going to come down to what your personal preference would be with the kind of general usage of the setup. Real Aaron, oh wow, I didn't know the S1H had live streaming. So no, the S1H doesn't. I'm HDMI out into my A10 Mini running through my desktop. So it's a much more comfortable environment that I normally have set up here for my broadcasting. Let's see here. FC, hey, welcome FC. Speaking of audio, I'm curious how Ozo audio on the G100 would perform. So it's actually another kind of really good point. The G100 having that Ozo audio technology, which if you're not aware of what that is it's spatial audio that was created by Nokia and originally deployed in some of their mobile phones, that basically uses the information like the focus points, the human detection, head detection, to angle and direct the microphones so that you can get more kind of isolated audio. For a trade show, it actually could work pretty well. I've used it a number of times down here in Austin, actually downtown, recording some training content where either I just kind of spaced and my microphone died and I just needed to record something because I wasn't maybe the most kind of organized when it came to the kit that I was doing. But yeah, it definitely works really well as far as the noise canceling because it has extra microphones instead of just the standard stereo that you typically see in interchangeable lens cameras. Though I don't know I really don't know how much you're going to see that go into the higher end cameras because it is still a relatively new technology in camera deployment. It's fairly commonly used in especially the Nokia phones for however many of those are still out there. But yeah, it's a very interesting thing moving forward. 9 out of 10 times though, I'm typically going to be using the XLR1 with lavalier of some sort. So primarily I've been using the AVX system. I do also have a Sarmonic TX system back here that's a 1 receiver, 2 transmitter that was actually given over to me by our ambassador Todd down here. So huge shout out Todd. Thank you for that microphone setup. And yeah, something like that usually is going to still give you a much better image quality, much better audio quality if you're using it in tandem with something like an XLR1 to get higher res audio. Let's see here. Rudolph, you do want 2 smartphones for this. Yeah. So yeah, having 2 smartphones, 2 displays is definitely going to be a good option for that. Jake asks, what are the anamorphic capability differences between the S1H and the S5? There's not really a huge number of differences as far as anamorphic recording goes, especially now that both of those cameras support RAW over HDMI. Which if you are going to be capturing any kind of external recording and you want to be shooting an anamorphic, the RAW flavors are going to give you a better overall product. If you send an anamorphic 4:3 aspect ratio image out over HDMI into any of the recorders to do ProRes, you're actually taking a 4:3 image and putting it in a 3840 by 2160 image. So you're going to get pillar boxes and letterbox when you're looking at it on the screen. So that means that you're not actually getting the full resolution that the anamorphic capture is going to be doing for you. Unless you're doing something like a 133 anamorphic, which is designed for 16:9. In that case, you could do it. But ultimately, the big difference between the S1H and the S5 is going to come down to how the image looks coming out of the camera. The S1H having a low-pass filter is going to massively reduce the risk of moire. Though with anamorphic lenses not being necessarily the sharpest lenses out there, you're probably not going to run into it too often in this case. But the massive advantage is really that the S1H can do 6K full open gate recording, which if you're using, I believe it's a 1.8 lens, 1.8 D-squeeze lens, and I could be slightly wrong on that. If someone shoots more anamorphic than I do, you can correct me on this. But if you're shooting a 3:2 aspect ratio image and you want to use something like a 1.8x anamorphic, you're able to get a much higher resolution image that can then be de-squeezed out for even higher resolution export. Since in open gate on the S1H, it's unlimited recording, it's 24 frame, and you're able to do full height and width of the sensor. So at that point, it's just about getting more of an image captured and making sure that you have lenses that are designed to cover it. Which is actually kind of a cool segue because one of the setups that we had at Cine Gear, it was actually the S1H hooked up with an Atlas 50mm anamorphic lens, to kind of show off what this kind of platform can do. For those that don't know, the LUMIX series for a number of years now, since the GH5 and technically even the GH4 for those that put it into 4K photo mode, you've been able to record anamorphic in our cameras. And what that means is that you're taking a 4:3 aspect image out of the sensor. So in Micro Four Thirds, it's typically the full sensor, or at least the full sensor height. And what that allows you to do is then bring it into software if you're using a 2x D-squeeze and de-squeeze the image into CinemaScope. So you're going to be able to get, that kind of traditional flary look depending on the optic that you're using. If you're up into the S-series cameras, it means that you're going to be using the Academy region of the sensor for 4:3 ratio, which means that you're using a Super 35 center area of it, but you're using a 4:3 aspect ratio. So you're getting pretty much the same, if not better, than what you see in some of the higher-end cinema cameras as far as the image area that you're recording. And all of this in a camera that's infinitely less expensive than the much higher end cinema cameras to shoot anamorphic with. And that's really, back to Jake with your question there about, the capability differences, is that if you know that you're going to be shooting much higher end production, go with an S1H. The S5 is an amazing camera, and it's great for, pickup shots if you're doing anamorphic. You can do full-blown anamorphic recording with it, but if you really do need to be a much longer term recording, and you need to be able to have a camera and setup that's maybe a lot better balanced for anamorphic, since those lenses are typically much larger and heavier, you're probably going to want to go with an H, since you get the unlimited recording, the active cooling, the dual SD cards, and just all of the number of tools that we have in the camera. So vector scope, waveform, luminance spot meter, stuff like that's going to be much more helpful in that camera. Let's see here. Photo Technic Interactive, LUMIX S high speed sync, not support 200 shutter speed, and Godox Lite, please best solution for high sync. I'm gonna need a little bit more information from you, Photo Technic. Let me know which camera you're using and which of the Godox flashes you're using, because you should be getting 250th of a second for sync speed without having to go into high-speed sync. Anything above that, you go to what's called high-speed sync, and then you can shoot much higher. Or if you're using the Lumix flashes, you can get 300, 300th of a second shutter sync speed, or 320th of a second, if you're using certain flashes. So, okay, so I see further down here. So it's an S5 and an S1. Let me know which flash you're using, Photo, and I'll try to see if I can get you some info. Because I use which flash is it? I can't see which flash it is from here. I use a Godox flash myself. I think it's like one of the V862 O's or 682 O. O is the model version of it. And that works great. I get 250th of a second sync out of it, no problem. DH, would it be possible to add anamorphic D-squeeze via firmware update to a G9 with the associated aspect ratios? I honestly don't know. The G9, while yes, it has really kind of had a renaissance in its line, it is still generally more a photographic focused product that just happens to be able to also do a lot of video functionality, although you do have time limitations on that camera due to thermals. So I don't know how many of those tools are going to be added into a G9, if they even can be added into a G9, because every camera that gets designed, processors are designed for what your feature set is. So if it wasn't designed necessarily for the anamorphic ratios, for de-squeezing camera, you might not always get all the functionality between each camera. So a little bit of a challenge in some cases, but it's a request that I've seen, and it will get brought up to our team in Japan as a feature request. Jake says, what is open gate and what does that mean when compared to cameras that aren't capable of open gate? That is another good question, Jake. So open gate basically just means that you're recording the full sensor area. So we typically see that, you record 16:9 aspect ratio for film or for video imagery. And it could also be 17:9 for those that are going to call me out because I didn't say 17:9 as well, or DCI. What open gate means is that you're going to use the most of the sensor that you possibly can. So for cameras like the GH5S or cameras like the BGH1, they have the ability to record in open gate because it's a 4:3 aspect ratio sensor. So that means that if I'm using this sensor, it's natively 4:3 aspect ratio. So I'm able to actually record full height and full width of this sensor so that I can do my anamorphic recording. usually you don't find it that often in interchangeable lens consumer cameras. A lot of the anamorphic lenses that you see coming out on the market that are starting to get into a much more affordable price point, if you notice, they're 133x D-squeeze. And in most cases, they're like that because they're designed for shooting and capturing on a 16:9 aspect ratio. So either in an APS-C camera or even micro four thirds, like if you look at some of the Soryu anamorphic lenses that we've talked about before on this show, those can work great for 16:9, but it also means that you can put them in 16:9 on the camera, or they work great for 4:3. You get a different aspect ratio, but when you put them in 16:9, you're going to get an anamorphic look that fills 16:9 when it's 133D squeezed. And it's actually going to give you some of the characteristics that anamorphic has, but you're not going to get letterbox on it. So you have some different looks available to you. Now, some of the cool things that are coming out, like Soryu just announced over on Indiegogo that they've got a full frame anamorphic coming out that I think is a 1.6x. I'd have to double check that one. But they have a full frame anamorphic coming out that I am very curious to see put on an S1H. And actually start to get to play with some of that stuff, because that one's going to be a 50 millimeter. I think it's a T2.9, so it's a really bright. You're going to be able to get some nice oval bokeh. You're going to get some of that cool flare that you have with anamorphic if it's something you're looking for, and you'll be able to take better advantage of something like an S1H or even the rest of the S1 or the S5 to be able to shoot in anamorphic and not necessarily break the bank trying to get some of these really cool lenses with it. So yeah, the whole point is just that OpenGate allows you to shoot full sensor height and width. It's the largest available recording. And even if you're not shooting in anamorphic, a lot of times shooting OpenGate can actually be pretty useful in cases where you may need to be reframing your image. So we always like to use a couple of the examples of, like 80s and 90s TV shows where they had stunts going on and you can really only do maybe one or two takes of it. And ideally, you're really only doing one take of it. And, it could be a car making a jump. Well, if you're masked off at 16:9, you got to make sure that you're keeping that car in the actual frame, in the 16:9 frame. Where if you shoot an open gate, you have height that you can play with. So in post, you can take that 16:9 crop out of the full sensor area, slide it up and down so that you can follow the image if you weren't necessarily the best at keeping it right in frame. It just gives you more flexibility. So hopefully that answers what OpenGate is. With the S1H, this is from JD. With the S1H, am I missing digital zoom somewhere in the menus? Looking to use PhotoJoseph's trick with keeping the camera in place, but temporarily zooming in target for gray card for white balance. So the S-series cameras no longer have what was called digital zoom or digital teleconverter. It's just renamed now. So now it's called image area of video. The reason we did this is that, primarily because most people were using it because you're trying to change from full sensor width to a 2x crop in or going to pixel to pixel. It just made more sense with the way people were using digital teleconverter and digital zoom to put it into the actual video functionality. So for something like that, if you're in the video mode, you do have the ability to assign to a custom function button the image area of video, which will allow you, depending on the frame rate that you're recording in, it will allow you to go full sensor width, or it'll say full, Super 35, or APS-C, depending on the camera you're in, and then it'll also let you go down into pixel. And the effect of that changes depending on what resolution you're shooting at. So if you're shooting in 1080 and you have it set to full, and then go to Super 35 or APS-C, it's going to be a pretty substantial cut in. And then if you go down to pixel in 1080 on something like the most visual one would be an S1R, it's a massive punch in because you're literally just taking the center 1920 by 1080 pixels out of the center of the frame to do your recording. So yeah, for something like that, take a look for the image area video, and you can change it. I don't think you can change it on fly while you're recording, so you'd have to stop recording, change over, or if you're only using it for the white set, you'd just map it to a custom function before you start recording and then just jump through them. Let's see here. Rec Production says, may I know which monitor that you suggest for video editing? That's a bit of a loaded question. Right now, I've upgraded my monitor. Well, the company has upgraded my monitor. I'm using an LG OLED 48-inch. I think it's a CX series, so one of the relatively newer ones. It's paired a lot of times with PCs for gaming and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I'm using one of those that has all like the filmmaker modes, the full customization to calibrate it. And that's been one of the nicest monitors I've ever had the luck of using, especially if you're not necessarily going to go spend the money on something like a Flanders or go to some of the higher end actual production monitors. You want to make sure that it has color accuracy. You want to make sure that it can actually reach the full color gamut that you're trying to edit with. So if you're trying to do HDR content, make sure that it's a monitor that actually fully supports HDR. Most computer monitors are not going to be rating on the highest scale for HDR. They're going to be something like HDR 400. In some cases, really inexpensive ones would be much cheaper. So there's a lot that go into it. A lot of it goes over my head, but I know that on our recommendations internally and what we use for some trade shows to show the best quality of the content, OLED is definitely going to be a really solid option for it, since you can really get true black and you can get really, really bright. But yeah, a lot of it's going to come down to what your budget's gonna have there. Let's see here. Photo says, I think I saw in here, it says you're using a Godox 8600 and a flash and a 685. Sing does not support light out. Put 50% reduced. I think you may want to be checking with Godox on that as to what the flash spec is for it, because like I said, I've got a Godox flash. Actually, I'm just gonna grab it. It's a lot easier for me to just grab the flash. So I'm using a V860-2 flash for mine, and that gives me absolutely no problems for higher speed syncing with it. Plus the nice advantage is that it's got a rechargeable battery pack, and then the X1 wireless trigger for off-camera flash work. That's about the best I think I can give you. I'm not fully up to date on the specs of all the different Godox flashes. So, let's see here. Jake says, is the S1H capable of a 1.6 D-squeeze for the lens that was just announced by Surrey? Or Surrey, I can never pronounce the name right. That camera does not have a 1.6x D-squeeze. It has the most common ones, 133, 13, 15, 18, and 20. So I'm curious to see what 1.6 comes out to. Martin says, it would be great if you could switch between pixel to pixel and full without stopping the recording. Is this something on the roadmap? I do not believe it is something on the roadmap. I think that is a hardware limitation. But it is something that we can definitely bring up. Being able to shift the image pipeline like that is not necessarily one of the easiest things to do and keep the quality that we're running. But it is something that we can bring up and mention to our engineers to see if it's something that they might think could be done. Let's see here. Rudolph says there's now a brand new LG 32-inch OLED monitor. Yes, there is that new one, and I think they're around like $4,000. The 48-inch one that I'm using here, it's not an overly expensive one. I mean, it's expensive, but they're not overly expensive, and it's been great. A little large for sitting. I mean, literally, it's my arms outstretched. It's basically at the edge of the lens here. It's a little large for this, but it's so nice working on an OLED display. Let's see here, JD. I saw image area video and have played with that. Couple extra steps, but it's not a huge deal. Yeah, so just as a heads up, no one's crazy. In the S series cameras, the digital zoom, what people used to use to do what image area of video is doing, yeah, it has been removed and, well, it's been renamed for this other process. Super Zero, welcome. Says, are the limitations of Lumix cameras or any camera more the processor versus the sensor? The iPhone 13 cinematic mode comes to mind as being the A15 rather than sensor. So cell phones versus cameras are very, very different animals. You're looking at a couple of different challenges there. Is that you're looking at one, that the image pipeline that's coming in from something like a mobile device, it's a very small sensor, and usually bit rates are relatively low. Now, I haven't seen a whole lot about what the new cinematic mode is with like reshifting focus and stuff, other than just some of the press info that I've seen. And some of that stuff is cool, but you're looking at a lot of the processing that's being done is done on an SoC as opposed to, or a full SoC that's designed, you know, by either Qualcomm or Apple or one of those companies to handle not just image processing, and then some of them are adding an image processing core in there. So a lot of it's just going to be very different worlds and different concepts between cameras and phones. Phones also take a huge advantage with the image processing for the images. We've all seen it when you go to take a picture and then you wait a couple of seconds after you take the picture, and then it looks even better because it gets pushed through their processing. Most times, at least from every conversation I've ever had with filmmakers, is that you want as little processing being done to an image as you can in camera because you want to actually control the look. So yeah, it's cool to see some of that stuff in phones, but it's still, I'd still argue that it's in its infancy of being an actual full-blown tool for high-end cinematography, and that's not to discount filmmakers that do work with iPhones. I think it's amazing. Use the tool that you can, and the fact that it's going to be able to do ProRes is kind of cool. Although it's, what is it, 6 gigs per 6 gigs per minute or something like that. So it's like some crazy space issue that you're going to run into there. So yeah, in cameras, you're limited typically by what processor is designed for, because they're specifically designed for a job. They're closer to an ASIC than they are, general processors. And then you are also limited to sensor, how fast the sensor can read out. That's why you see, as cameras change over time, you start seeing that, readout speeds get better, which means rolling shutter gets less. In different modes, you'll see that rolling shutter can be really, kind of rough in one mode, but then really fast in another because you're using a smaller sensor region. It's a very, very complex equation to figure out, is to pinpoint where a limitation would be coming in. Plus, you're working with sensors and processors that are much bigger, so they generate a lot more heat, which means then you also have to keep heat management in mind. If you've ever shot something really long form on a phone, you realize how fast the battery dies and how hot the mobile devices get. So yeah, it just kind of goes into that point, is that they're tools, and I would never disparage someone from using a tool to get the job done. It's kind of one of the points as to why a lot of our cameras can do some of the things that they can. Is not necessarily that you're going to go out and shoot the next blockbuster on an S1H, but its Netflix approval means that you could if you wanted to, or you can mix it in with your mainline cameras and not be limited to the runtime of the content being shot on cameras other than your main camera. Let's see here. Alan says, I mentioned on Facebook about the FN1 cycling through all outputs on the BGH1, which is awkward in live settings if you're using both. The quick menu effect shrinks the output without display. Why is that? I did see your comment there, and I actually haven't had a chance to bring that up to some of our team. So, Alan, I will bring that up with our engineers and see if I can get an answer with some of that, and I'll do some testing on my own. Let's see here. I cannot pronounce that name. Do you think new Lumix cameras will change their AF systems? I have no comment on AF systems anymore. I'm kind of tired of talking about AF. Sorry. But what I can tell you is that we've been using autofocus for this stream, and it seems to be working perfectly fine. Jake says, I often find when I use auto exposure outside, my subjects are typically underexposed. Is there a way to set auto exposure to 2+ stops? Yes, there is. So in the Lumix cameras, and again, I didn't get all of that stuff set up yet. In some of the Lumix cameras, you have the ability to do exposure offset. What this allows you to do is go into the camera, into the menu, and you can actually program and say, if I'm using center weighted metering, I want to have my exposure pushing or overexposing or underexposing by default, so that when you're looking through the viewfinder and it says 0 exposure, it's actually overexposing or underexposing based on the input that you put in. However, the fact that you're mentioning that you're having to adjust by around 2 stops, Jake, makes me think that if you're shooting stills, I'm willing to bet that you're shooting stills in Vlog. And then when you're bringing them into software, Lightroom, Capture One, whatever raw editing software, now you're seeing the image just get really dark and you have to push your exposure by 2. That is specifically because you're shooting a log profile in a still raw image that's trying to compress everything. You do not want to shoot still images in RAW using Vlog. Standard color profile that's on the camera, anything outside of Vlog, has more dynamic range available when you're shooting RAW than shooting log. Log is a specific tool designed to cope with 10-bit and 8-bit files, like at least in this kind of case. So if you're shooting JPEG and you're shooting in Vlog to match a still to your frame, you're kind of okay with it. You can get away with doing it. But if you're shooting raw images, just don't be shooting Vlog. Shoot a standard color profile, and you won't have to deal with that exposure issue. Let's hear. JD says, I think this has been brought up before, but is it possible to have custom white balance capture results added to appear on the screen? Right now, the only way is to see it in editing. We have asked. I don't know if that's something that can be easily added into it. I know that the metadata information is there. It's just a matter of if it's something that can actually be put into the actual live playback so that you can actually see it. But it is something that we will, I will bring up again with our team. FC says, another curiosity, for pixel to pixel readout in video recording, it would be nice to be able to choose the crop location instead of center, such as using for things like lens babies. Yeah, I think something like that starts to go into the very niche use of some of these features. So yeah, being able to do pixel to pixel and then say like you want to move it to like rule of thirds, truthfully, I don't know how often that would actually be used in the broad scale of things being used. As it is, cameras in general, while yes, we do push a lot of technologies and a lot of ways to use cameras that may not necessarily be the most commonly thought of, so things like anamorphic, there typically has to be a big enough call for something like that to even actually go down the path of if it's even possible to do. As of right now, it's pretty much just going to be setting, where you've got center, it's just making the center punch in because that's the region that you're working with. When you start cropping out into the other sides, then you start running into, well, how's the stabilizer going to be affected? What's distortion going to look like if you're using lenses that aren't corrected electronically? But it is something, again, as you guys comment on these videos, as you're interacting in the chat, our team see these, so it does get brought up. Let's see here. Super says, follow-up, GH5 and 5 Mark II are almost there with 3 focus transitions. Seems like AI is the linchpin to achieve something similar. For related to cinematic mode. Yeah, so we do have the ability to program in your focus pulls and have them repeatable. And that's been in the series for a while now, since the GH5. it's an area where I think if you're looking at a camera versus a phone, cameras are going to be a more purpose-driven tool. So it's not necessarily going to be like an afterthought, like, oh, well, maybe I want to shift focus, something like that. It's usually you're going to use a camera when you have maybe a little bit more of a deliberate plan that you're trying to execute. So, yeah, it'd be cool, and AI is definitely a very large part of why phones have gotten relatively good in some areas that they can work with. But ultimately, if you put them side by side, it's going to come down to what your use case is going to be as to which is probably better for your setup. Let's see here. JC, with the BGH1, will there be a better way to record ProRes RAW than Ninja V? Currently need 2 monitors, one to change settings in the menu and one to record clean HDMI out. Since RAW on the BGH1 is out over HDMI, your HDMI is, when you're using it, it's blocked because you're using the data pipeline for that. What you can do is when you're recording RAW out over HDMI on the BGH1, that's where the app can come in handy, because if you link the app up, you'll have the ability to change exposure settings. You'll be able to go in and actually adjust a number of settings for the camera and not have to have 2 monitors attached to it. It can be a little bit of a pain if you're trying to be recording ProRes RAW and you want to be able to adjust some settings on the camera. But using the app can be an alternative. It's something I can bring up to see if there's maybe another creative way to do it, so that you can actually still see. But yeah, inherently RAW over HDMI is a bit of a challenge because you're taking up that image pipeline for data at that point. Let's see here. Separate note. Thank you so much. Well, thank you for joining, JD. Let's see here. Jake, do you know when the Lumix Love competition ends? Let me actually take a check on that. I will take a look, because I think so the Lumix Love the Instagram contest, that's the one that we're running over on our global Instagram page. So if you haven't seen it, make sure to go take a look at that. That campaign, it's a good question. I'm actually not sure. I will take a look and then I will let everyone know in the chat. Which actually kind of segues to one of the things I wanted to mention. If you're not already doing so, make sure to go check out our the Lumix Instagram account, the Lumix USA page. I interact with a lot of people over there, so if you guys have questions that you want to continue after streams like this, make sure to go follow us over on Lumix, the USA channel page. I think I actually gave you the international one. Let me give you the USA one. So let me actually remove this and drop this one in here because I don't monitor the international one. Go take a look at us over on Instagram, the Lumix USA, the link that I just dropped in the chat. And I'm able to interact with some folks over there as well when we're not doing these live streams. It helps us out a lot if you're following us on a bunch of these different platforms. So, one of the things that I wanted to make sure I get to before we end is probably one of the coolest things that I've seen us do with the BGH1 box camera. And that's how we were demoing it out at Cine Gear. And it's, like I said, it's something that as long as plans and everything stay the way they are, I mean, we all saw what happened with NAB getting canceled. As long as the next couple of shows that myself, Matt, and our other counterpart, Neil, are going to be working, there's a really cool integration for those that are doing, kind of studio setups or multicam environments, or environments where you need to be using what are called PTZ cameras or pan tilt zoom cameras. We've had the opportunity to actually work with the company Data Video, and they make a pan tilt head, which actually I've got up on the screen here that I can show you guys. So they make this unit here, which is a pan tilt controller. This allows you to put the camera into it and then interface with the camera based on a couple different ports, different connections that you're going to be using for camera control. And it allows you to turn your BGH1 into a PTZ camera. One of the other cool things is that they also have, because if you're looking at this, you would need a power zoom lens to actually start zooming. If you get something, say, like a 50 to 200 millimeter, and they have the Tilta Nucleus M, there's also the ability to integrate that into the system to be able to control zooming of manually zooming lenses. So with a device like this and the BGH1, you're able to have a camera that allows you to do multiple different things than you would normally be doing with just a traditional PTZ camera. So full control over it, you have multiple different options available, and it's a pretty affordable choice here. You know, you're looking at traditional PTZ options, you know, some of ours that are like, you know, close to $10,000, maybe a little bit more, and they use anywhere between a 1/2 inch to a 1 inch size sensor. You go to something like a BGH1 that's got a 4/3 sensor. It has its Netflix approval, so you know its image quality is going to be solid. You have the entire availability of micro 4/3 lenses for it, so you're able to put pretty much any optic you want on this thing. And then with 1 or 2 extra little pieces, you're able to then attach up and turn that camera into PTZ, but not have to have the camera stay stagnant as a PTZ camera. When you're not using it in a studio environment or in a stage environment where you need it like that, you can then just pop the camera off, put it on a Ronin, and you're off to the races. You're able to actually work with the camera outside of just a single-use tool. And it was one of the cooler things that we were showing at Cine Gear. Actually watching people come over and play with the controller, zoom with it, get it calibrated to whatever lens we had on there. We had a 50 to 200 millimeter on there. So yeah, it's a pretty cool option that works incredibly well with cameras like the BGH1. So wanted to make sure I mentioned that. We should have more information about it. I don't think it's fully available for purchase just yet. Still working on a couple of the last little pieces, I think, on the data video side. But it's a really solid, cool thing for us to be able to offer with a new camera that, you know, just most people may not necessarily think that they would have needed beforehand. So let's see here. Justin says, thanks for doing this. Will we see some prime lenses in the L mount with hard stops on focus and smooth aperture? I don't know if you'd see lenses that have hard stops in the traditional sense, like what, like early manual focus lenses where you go to the end and it just hard stops. I don't know of any camera manufacturer now that's doing lenses like that outside of an actual dedicated cinema lens. But as far as Stepless Iris, we do have Stepless Iris in the lenses. It's a little bit of a different way than I think what you're asking for. So lenses like the 10 to 25 and 25 to 50 that have the clutch and the aperture ring where you can click it in out of the auto mode and then it's legitimately a smooth aperture control. Those do exist in micro 4/3. I don't know if you're going to see those in the full frame system. That would be something well above my pay grade to see if to comment on if it's coming. But the lenses do have a Stepless Iris built into them so that as you're changing it, you're not going to get the stepping that you'd see if you are manually changing the iris, and if you're doing it through the camera. So you'll see it'll actually just kind of bloom, is what I like to call it. So they technically exist, just not necessarily in the way that I think you're looking for them to exist, Justin. The Real Aaron says, Panasonic, as far as I'm concerned, have always been a pioneer in innovators as far as cameras and shooting is an issue. I believe they're getting better and even improving on their focusing. Well, thank you for the kind words, Aaron. Let's see, JC, thanks, man. Will the BGH1, does it work with the DJI Raven Eyes for autofocus? That's a good question. I'm not sure. I think that's up to how the Raven Eyes actually integrates with whatever camera you've got attached to it. Because the Raven Eyes autofocus thing that sits on the top, that I think that's the LiDAR thing. One, it's a very limited field of view as to what it can actually use to focus. But I'm honestly not sure if it has direct control into the camera. I don't really have any of that equipment to test or to actually be able to comment on. But I do know that, like, as far as the tracking part of what Raven Eyes brings, so the active track system, that is something that we have integrated into some of our cameras, and that DJI has integrated in with the RS2 and the RSC2. But it's a question that I will bring up the next time I talk to our team. Let's see here. Hi, Sean. Thanks for the IS lock. E-stabilization advice was actually electronic stabilization was causing a weird movement. Oh, I'm glad you were able to join us. So there was a question before the stream today from one of the viewers. I'm not really not going to try to pronounce and butcher your handle here on YouTube. That was about a situation where stabilization was being used in the camera and you were seeing framing shifting in the image when using things like face detection or body detection, stuff like that. And as a kind of, I'd say, cautionary note for people out there, one of the downsides of using electronic stabilization, and this is fairly true for every company that deploys an electronic stabilization system, is that you can get artifacts when you do electronic stabilization in a camera that can cause unwanted looks to your image. One of those can be in some cameras, and we've seen this across a couple different cameras out there in the market, where the image, the electronic stabilization is looking on through data, looking at what it needs to stabilize with. And if you've got face detection or you've got a stable shot and you're working with that, you may notice that it actually tries to start following the face. So if I'm doing this, you actually may see the image try to move with my face, and then the background looks really weird. You get that kind of weird effect that doesn't necessarily look the best in the world. So if you ever notice something like that, make sure electronic stabilization is turned off in the camera, and then use post-stabilization in the software of your choice, because typically you'll have more horsepower to actually work with those to get, maybe a higher level post-stabilization through Premiere, or I don't know. I don't really do much post-stabilization, so I can't really comment on what software really would work best for you. But yeah, doing it in post is going to probably give you a better result. SuperZoom says, why was there never a YAGH evolution for the GH5? Because it wasn't needed. The YAGH, while yes, it gave you quad SDI out and it gave you XLR audio, it was a very large, cumbersome adapter that needed to be powered on its own. The XLR1 audio adapter basically, kind of replaced it in the GH5 and gives you a much more sleek tool to be doing that. While, yes, you don't have SDI through something like that, the XLR1 just gives you the high-end audio, which is what the vast number of people that were buying the YAGH were commenting that they really, kind of wanted. So yeah, that's why there wasn't a YAGH follow-up. Jake says, do you anticipate any of your MFT cameras being capable of full-fledged vlog? So I've covered this a couple of times on the streams, and I'll cover it as often as people have questions about it. Vlog L in Micro Four Thirds is a full-fledged vlog. It is vlog designed for the sensor characteristics, so it maximizes the amount of dynamic range that a Micro Four Thirds sensor that's been profiled is capable of doing. Just slapping vlog into a Micro Four Thirds camera is not going to help you. It does not magically give you more dynamic range. That's not how it works. So yes, it's Vlog L, and yes, they have different clipping points, but that's because the sensors have different capabilities of dynamic range. So yeah, there's differences there. Vlog versus Vlog L is just a classification on what the maximum capability is of the sensor that is being deployed on, because every sensor that runs Vlog or Vlog L is profiled to get the most dynamic range and the lowest noise. So you get the right balance between noise and dynamic range to maximize it out. Yeah, that's kind of it. Just slapping Vlog into a Vlog-L camera is not going to change anything. Justin says, pardon if this has already been asked, or if it's just time, but can you tell us anything about the upcoming GH6? Is it coming out? So I don't have anything that I can share about the GH6 other than what we've talked about at launch. So it will be a new sensor and a new engine that you haven't seen before. It will do 5.7K 60p. It'll do 4K 120. And I know I'm forgetting some of the other things that we've talked about at the launch. Stick with us. Make sure to be following us on the different social platforms, and that's where you will get the information first. And obviously, when that camera comes out, we will be talking about it on Lumix Live. You can be sure that it is something that we will be talking about on this channel when it does come. So, yeah, sorry I don't have any more information about that. I wish I did. I wish I could share more information, but I just can't. Let's see here. Super Zoom says, what about timecode? I have to buy an Atomos sync adapter. Why not include it in the camera? Which camera are you talking about again? Super Zero? I forget which camera. Oh, on the Mark II, I would imagine. Yeah, so, yeah, the timecode... So the camera can send timecode out over HDMI, but you can't inject timecode into it. It uses timecode for triggering. It's just not something that camera is equipped to work with. The GH5S has the ability to use that adapter that goes into the PC sync port that allows you to do timecode in and out. Cameras like the BGH1 have the ability to do timecode in and out through the actual BNC connector on it. The S1H can do timecode in and out. So yeah, you've just got some different hardware needs to be able to do it internally, and externally. So yeah, the GH5 just doesn't have it, or GH5 Mark II doesn't have timecode in. So here, Jake says, thanks for clarifying Vlog and MFT. Yeah, and to be fair, it's not about people being haters or anything like that. A lot of times, these kinds of conversations come from either a misunderstanding of what is actually being done, or just not necessarily misinformation, but just parts of the story being told. And that's one of the reasons why we have these live events. We make it so that you guys can ask these kinds of questions, and you don't have to feel off by asking a question like that. That's why I'm here. I love answering questions as best that I can. So, yeah, keep asking them. I will always do my best to get you guys an answer and explain things if at all possible. Let's see here. Alan says, full frame sensor and L mount on an MFT body. Bingo, MFT Vlog. Well, you basically could go to the S5 at that point. The S5 is about the same size as the GH5 and GH5 Mark II. And you've got full Vlog in that because it works with the proper dynamic range. It's able to actually hit the benchmark that's needed to be considered Vlog. And you're close to the same size. And with the 1.8 series lenses, which I have my 50 here. The rest of my lenses are still packed up. But yeah, with the 1.8 series lenses, you're getting pretty close back down to some of the Micro Four Thirds sizes, though not completely, because sensor size, the overall package in Micro Four Thirds will still always be smaller than full frame. So let's see here. Mike says, GH6 is going to be insane. Can't wait to have to decide between an S1H and a GH6. Love your little MFT glass. Yeah, when we can share more information about the GH6, I'm sure people are going to be excited. Last question I'm going to take for today. Super Zero again. Is timecode why the BGH1 is Netflix approved versus GH5 Mark II? There are many, many, many factors that go into why a camera gets chosen by Netflix to get its approval. With the BGH1, yeah, timecode I'm sure helped. really make that decision. But if you go over to the Netflix Post Technology Alliance page and look at what the requirements are for a camera to achieve their A camera listing, read through that documentation. That'll give you a good indication of why some cameras are capable of it and why other cameras aren't. Yeah, it is. It's a very interesting read for anyone that's really looking into that kind of stuff. Let's see here. And actually, I will take the last question here, which is from Mike. Says, best performance pancake Panasonic lens. It's going to vary depending on what your classification of a pancake lens is. Personally, I'm partial to the 15mm f1.7 Summilux. So partial enough that I got the optic design tattooed on me. That's a solid lens to go with. There is also the 20mm f1.7 as well as the 14mm 2.5, I believe that one's 2.5, that are out there. It's going to really come down to what focal length you're looking at. If you're looking in the Micro Four Thirds, in the Lumix line of Micro Four Thirds lenses. The 15, I can't speak high enough about of. I love that lens, but I love the 30mm, 35mm field of view. Though I have transitioned a little bit more into shooting 24mm, so that's why, like, usually I've got my 12-1.4 Summilux on my BGH1 when I'm using it for broadcasting. But yeah, the 15 it's a little thicker than traditionally what people think of as pancake. The 20 and the 14 are really what people would consider pancake lenses. So yeah, with that, I think we're going to call it. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. This was it was a nice change to get back into the studio where I just know things work, and I'm not having to sit on the side of a mountain and sweat like crazy, or be out at a trade show. I love getting back to some of the events where I'm actually able to meet some of you in person. It was really cool seeing some of you out at Cine Gear. If anyone is in the market, in the Nashville, Tennessee market, and you happen to be going to the SALT Expo, if it's a show that you go to, make sure to come by and take a look at us, the Lumix booth when we're there. We will most likely be a recorded broadcast that week since I will be away. And let me just double check the calendar. Yes, because that would be the 21st of October. For that Thursday. So most likely that's going to be a recorded stream. So we will be doing a YouTube premiere on the 21st. Outside of that, thank you everybody for joining. I want to remind everybody about the Lumix Pro services. We have the Red and the Platinum tier available here in the United States. The Red tier would be free. So anyone that's got a Lumix camera, make sure to go take a look at the Lumix Pro services website to check out the eligibility requirements for it. If you're coming to us overseas or outside of the United States, make sure to take a look at the Lumix Pro Services global page where you can take a look for Lumix Pro Services in your region. If you aren't already, make sure to go over to Instagram and follow us on Instagram. It's at Lumix USA. I dropped the link in the chat. You can continue the conversations over there with us. Check out the content that we post. It's another platform where if we've got new content coming out, you will see it there. With that, thank you again, everybody. If you liked this stream and you like this type of stream, make sure to give us a like. Make sure to subscribe to the Lumix Cameras channel here on YouTube. It helps me out tremendously in being able to bring you guys more content and make this even bigger than we have been over the last year. Outside of that, I hope everyone has a good rest of your week, and I look forward to talking to everybody next week, which would be October 7th. Yeah, so we'll be posting the links for these streams sometime next week. So make sure to join us here Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time on October 7th, and we'll keep these conversations going. With that, take care, everybody. Hope you have a good rest of your week.